Welcome to Cheshire Corners. I'm Sebastian Coco, and I'll be your host as we trip through the looking glass. Thanks for coming back to Psychospotlight, the series where we shine a specific spotlight on a specific individual in the psychedelics industry. Today we're joined by Bjorn I'm sorry, Bjorn. Pronounce your last name for me really quickly.
Fritzsche.
Fritzsche. Thank you. We're joined by Bjorn Fritzsche, who is a senior chemical engineer over at the Rose City Labs in Portland, Oregon. So thank you so much for joining us, Bjorn. And we'll have Bjorn's co-worker / boss, Daniel Hughes, on over at the Daniel Hughes group. He'll be on next month. So definitely keep a lookout for that. But thank you for coming on this month, Bjorn.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. So before we get into too much about testing and the specifics of Rose City, I want to talk more about you. So talk to me a little bit about yourself before we get into Rose City. From my kind of brief research, you were a chemical engineer at Dortmund University. How does a chemical engineering major that loves Science Cat t-shirts, saw that one on your fun facts too, how do you go from kind of that, the studying of chemistry to the cutting edge of the chemistry for recreational drugs? I mean, as someone who was going to get his PhD for a while and still has a lot of friends who are kind of climbing the ladder of academia, scientific research, I'd love to know more about your personal story in that way.
Yeah, it was honestly a number of odd circumstances. I moved to the US shortly after I graduated, and after a brief time in the Midwest just to get my immigration paperwork and everything done, moved to Portland, Oregon, and initially actually worked in technology here. I worked for a couple different internet companies and software companies because there wasn't really that big of a market for chemists or chemical engineers here. And then during the Great Recession, I ended up being laid off, but fortunately was financially fairly solid at the time, so I kind of got a little bit more involved into the whole medical marijuana industry here. Initially just, learning about it, meeting people, and right around the same time is when the dispensary booming happened, when the first medical-only dispensaries were opening. Daniel, who you talked to earlier, actually owned one of those first dispensaries, and I got in contact with him, met him, and ended up helping him out with a number of different things at his dispensaries in the sense of compliance work, etc. And then he had already started Rose City Labs basically in his basement. But right around that time was when he expanded and really rolled it out into a real separate company. That was in combination of some legal changes here to the medical program that for the first time required the testing of cannabis that was sold in these dispensaries.
Gotcha.
And it was honestly a lot of just being in the right place at the right time. I worked for him for about 2 years, and then actually moved on to a different lab that had offered me a position. Also, there were some personal reasons involved, nothing to do with Dan, actually. It was I was joining another company because my, at the time, girlfriend was working there, and I wanted to work together with her.
Sure.
And and then basically got into the whole, that's when the state really started taking over the laboratories, or more specifically, started regulating and accrediting them. And I was made a quality manager at that laboratory and worked there for a few years, getting them basically up to snuff with the state rules and getting them accredited. And shortly after that, I got a job offer from a processing company that was newly opening, industrial size cannabis processor, supercritical extraction, spinning band distillation, hydrocarbons, you name it, we made it. And worked there for quite a while and enjoyed it. But eventually was getting kind of sick of the repetitiveness of the industrial chemistry, basically, and had, shortly after the whole COVID shutdown, had the opportunity of rejoining Rose City Labs, and did so, and I also knew at the time that Dan was interested in the whole magic mushroom psilocybin, the new emerging market. And I had a really lot of fun working in the emerging market for cannabis. So I figured, it's a new startup thing. It's a new market, and I joined and really enjoying it so far.
That is really awesome. It seems like a lot of people in the psychedelics industry, or that are moving to the psychedelics industry, really got their start strongly in cannabis. And you would hear over at Cheshire Corners, like, I'm currently coming at you from the Coffee Joint, which is like a cannabis consumption lounge attached to a dispensary that are all owned by this, like, my boss and also the co-owner of Cheshire Corners. So there's it seems that there's a really big, substantial push from cannabis to psychedelics. Like, it's almost like the next natural step for a lot of people.
I agree. And in addition to that, most of the people that work in cannabis have still the fresh experience of starting in a new market, and that is obviously applicable to this new market as well.
No, I totally agree. I've also heard a lot of, because I've talked to different vendors we've had around, different, administrators, all within the cannabis industry, and there's a kind of a general consensus that the corporate bloat is starting to really dig into the cannabis industry, especially in kind of the last couple of years when marijuana prices have been dropping wholesale and commercially like crazy. So I think it's very, I don't know, I think it's interesting to hear that perspective from all sides, from both hey, we want to just tackle an emerging market, and also this is the market that we were in and we are still in and still love is just getting slow, and
exactly.
people are kind of bored with that.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with it too. That's part of the reason why I'm working with these more interesting substances as a chemist, because there were not much science done on them in the past due to their legal status. I actually get to do something new. I get to do something that hasn't really been done on scale, and there's really not that much in a production lab that you get to do that is actually new. In other areas like water testing, etc., everything is pre-prescribed. The methodologies are set by the government. You know what machine you need. You know how you have to do it. With cannabis and now with psilocybin, it's all new. Nobody has done it really before on scale, and so I got to do new things, and I really enjoyed that, obviously.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I mean, I don't remember if I told you this in like the initial discovery meeting that we had, but I was like on my track to get a PhD initially in either neuroscience or neurochemistry, something in that field. Actually, maybe genetics too. And it was psychedelics, and it ended up redirecting me towards art. But and one of the big things that helped redirect me towards art is the fact that in academia, it's so hard to express originality. Like, that's it's hard to be on the cutting edge. It's hard to be doing new things because you're so reliant on all of the well-cited things that came before you. And that's something that I'm still trying to bring to this channel of, we have really highly sourced and cited lecture videos almost on what are magic mushrooms, what are psychedelics, all that kind of stuff. So I'm trying to bring some of that academic flair, but I really agree with you that there's like a discovery moment on the cutting edge of science right now that is like centered on psychedelics, and it's really cool to be doing new things for a new industry. So I can really sympathize with that personally. So correct me if I'm wrong, but Rose City Labs primarily does testing on recreational drug substances like cannabis and psilocybin. So can you tell me a little bit more about your role in making all of that happen as a senior chemist?
First thing, yes, cannabis is definitely our bread and butter primarily, and psilocybin is coming in as well. But we do actually have full environmental labs, so we also do water testing for schools. We do asbestos testing. We can test food products for contamination, heavy metals, etc. Some of it simply has overlap with the cannabis and the psilocybin markets, so we offer all of those services. My job here is basically whenever something new happens or we want to bring some kind of new test on, Or if in many cases the state expands the testing requirements for the products that we already test, it is my job to determine, do we have the equipment, do we have the staffing, what methodologies are we using or are we supposed to be using, and then basically get the initial testing off the ground. Then there's usually a time period where we do method validation and optimization and getting everything to the point that it can be run every day without major problems in a production lab. I mean, we have to run the same test, most cases, a few hundred times a day, so it has to work every time. And and then at the end, I gather all the validation data and combine that, and in most cases we then submit that to our state regulators, who sometimes just go over the data and give us a thumbs up, or sometimes they come out, they interview people, they look at our equipment, they really make sure that what we're doing is scientifically valid, and that but the numbers or the results that we're producing is something that is, well, legally defensible, I guess, is the most important part there, because in the end we are protecting consumers from harmful substances. We're making sure that psychoactive compounds are dosed accurately. All of those things, we have to get those right.
No, absolutely. And I mean, that's from, I wanted to say just kind of personally, because I've benefited from a lot of the cannabis in Colorado, and I don't know the history of like cannabis regulation or any, psychoactive I'm not going to say I'm a scholar in any of that, but I have to imagine that since you guys have been doing this since 2011, 2012, from what I was talking with you and Daniel, like that, some of the protocols that you have pioneered have inevitably leaked their way into like the commercial products in Colorado. So from one Westerner to another, thank you very much. Like, and I appreciate that. And even if you weren't, even if though you were born in Germany, like West Coast all the way, man. Like, I really appreciate it. And it's clear to me that you and Daniel, in talking to you guys, have like had a substantial impact on the regulation industry. So I just wanted to like voice that, name it, and say that I personally really appreciate it.
I mean, most of it has really just, maybe I have a gift for being at the right place at the right time, because that's 95% of my involvement with initially the medical program and with the lab testing. As I said, I work for dispensaries. It all just kind of, people always ask me, like, how do I get into this industry? How do I do this? How did I do it? I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. And that's kind of, honestly, that is primarily how my path went in here. It's obviously I was interested into cannabis. I enjoyed cannabis. I still do occasionally. And part of the reason why I decided when I moved from Germany here to Oregon was because of the fact that it was de facto decriminalized here already, and that there was a medical program, because I assumed I will continue to enjoy it, and I didn't want to be somewhere where, like, when I lived in the Midwest, where simple possession could mean, like, serious jail sentences, versus in Oregon at this point, we have every drug decriminalized. Marijuana is fully legalized, and psilocybin is, as part of the medical program, available. But effectively, all drug possession for personal amounts here essentially result in a traffic ticket at this point. While that brings other issues that Oregon has in that regard, primarily that this legalization was promised to also have treatment facilities for people with addiction problems, which didn't really happen on the scale that they are needed. It's still, I believe, it's definitely a better approach than the classic war on drugs.
Yeah, well, I totally agree, and it was very interesting because on the same series we had a guest from Amsterdam, Maja Kohek, she's an ICEERS researcher, and I talked to her a lot about kind of the standards in Europe, especially as far as decriminalization goes, and I think obviously there's a lot of semantic cultural differences between what's going on in Europe and America, so I'm not going to try to draw those lines like 100% they're the same, but the general mantra of pretty much everything is decriminalized, it comes down to a traffic ticket, and then we're going to go from there, even if it varies from state to state like it does country to country in Europe. I think that could be really productive for for just how drugs are treated in the States. Because I agree with you, the classic war on drugs approach is not good, and it just creates stuff like the huge issue we have with pharmaceuticals right now. You know, the Sackler family lawsuit and the opiate crisis. Like, that kind of snuck up on us because of how we treated every drug. So and then kind of separated that from the medical field. So I agree with you, and I could have a multiple hour-long conversation about like the exact failures of like how the war on drugs approach criminalization, penalization, all those kinds of things. Like, I'm 100% on the same page with you on that.
Yeah, it's definitely, as I said, how it's currently on that kind of on the same topic. I'm almost, at least, it's always a complicated answer, but I've been asked about this recently by somebody, how I would feel if, you know, specifically psilocybin would be descheduled, would no longer be a Schedule 1 substance. And it's actually a really complex answer, because I feel that the way how the cannabis market developed, how we still have craft growers, we still have fairly small companies, we don't have any like major corporations controlling everything, or at least even those have to operate in individual, like in each state separately, and we did not have the pharmaceutical industry essentially take stuff over. A lot of it is because cannabis is still a Schedule 1, and currently psilocybin is as well. And I think that while on some level I obviously want it all descheduled, on some other level it's almost like, yeah, but maybe for a year or two let the local markets develop, let those small businesses grow and succeed, and so they have a chance to actually stand up to those like massive pharmaceutical companies once those compounds are effectively no longer scheduled.
No, that's a totally valid point, because if in Colorado and Oregon and California, you know, you had big pharmaceutical companies starting to move in and, you know, like basically take over the market, it would not be a lucrative industry for cannabis specifically now, because of how advanced and developed those economies are within those states. So I totally agree with you, actually. I never really thought of it from that perspective, but allowing different regions to develop local practices and local economies with these drugs before basically allowing the national dogs of war to run over them, it could basically synthetically create like the natural way that a lot of East Coast economies were built, as far as family businesses slowly turning into bigger corporations and, you know, staying and mixing alongside people that are still there. So I think that's like a very pertinent, like, general economic question for America today. And I think that's a great point, man. Like, I never thought of it before like that. I would always be like, scheduling, grr. But I think that you're right. It's more complicated than just doing away with Nixon era war on drugs oldness. There are like a lot of real world present ramifications, and the DEA, actually, you're totally right, defends a lot of regionality very unintentionally, which is, I never would have thought of that, but the diversity of economy is totally due to its schedule, like the fact that it is scheduled. So can you tell me a little bit more about how the actual testing process works for gathering accurate percentages of both psilocybin and THC? And this is from, you know, getting the sample, isolating the compounds within that sample, and then kind of going from there. How do you get accurate percentages? You know, what is an accurate representation? That's a huge question for me. And this is, I think, something to think about alongside that. Both, like, for cannabis specifically, we know that there's a host of alkaline chemicals that are like at play when it comes to the high experienced by them. So are you guys currently, like, this is a very active topic of conversation for me. Are you guys currently trying to look in this, you know, do the same sort of categorization for psilocybin bearing mushrooms? Because there's a lot of different alkaloid chemicals that have some sort of you know, bearing on what happens with your trip. So it's kind of two questions together, but, you know, if you could.
Yeah, sure. Let me start at the beginning. For the testing process, it actually starts almost a little bit before the sample, because we first, to be able to accurately represent a batch of either cannabis or mushrooms, it's pretty similar actually, the testing process, at least for the potency aspect of it. We have to do a representative sampling. We have basically a very specific protocol where we take samples from random spots and a certain amount of each batch, so that what we later take back to the lab or actual sample is representative of that batch. Otherwise, if you just pick and choose, in the early days every grower would bring us their nicest nug out of the batch, but that's not really super representative. And specifically on mushrooms, you have quite a bit of variance between individual mushrooms, even if they were grown together. There's separate flushes, there's separate, like, you harvest the fruiting bodies multiple times from the same substrate, and there can be quite a variance in between those. So we try to address that from the very beginning by essentially having representative samples.
Gotcha.
From there, they come to the lab, we homogenize them. Basically, we grind them up into a fine powder so that everything is even. And the next step is the extraction process. We use various solvents, primarily methanol, to extract, ironically enough, both cannabis and psilocybin mushrooms, although the actual processes in the extraction is quite a bit difficult, since the compounds in magic mushrooms, psilocybin and psilocin, and the minor ones are a bit more sensitive, so we're a bit more gentle with them in the extraction process. But in both cases, once we complete the extraction process and filter out any remaining biomatter, we end up with essentially an methanol solution which contains all the compounds that we want to measure. From there, we use, for the potency determination, we use something called a high-performance liquid chromatograph. It's essentially a machine that pumps solvent. Solvent is being pumped through the machine, and the sample, a small amount of the extract, gets injected into this solvent stream, and that then makes it to something called an analytical column. And the column has the effect that each compound takes a different amount of time to make it through this column. It's being retained. It's a retention time for each compound that is different. And so on the other end of the column, they come out one after another. And then we use various types of detectors for cannabinoids as well as the psilocybin compounds. We use a UV detector that essentially shines a very specific wavelength of UV light through the solvent stream, and the carbon rings in those compounds absorb very specific wavelength, and then we can simply measure on how much is being absorbed, how much there was, and then we calculate that back up to the essential milligram per gram or percentage value, whatever the client would like to have those values in.
Okay.
That is basically the potency testing. For cannabis, we also do further testing, like things like pesticides, which is done in a very similar way, just with a much more sensitive detector. We use something called a mass spectrometer, or actually a triple mass spectrometer, and a liquid chromatograph, which that literally looks at ion fragments of the individual molecules, then collides them with a collision gas, and then looks how they break apart. And that can positively identify a compound, like a pesticide, in a product. We also use those equipment for when we test other psychoactive mushrooms, primarily Amanita muscaria, which has gotten a bit more popular in the Midwest apparently recently. And for most other things, we use, like, for example, heavy metal testing. We use the same equipment that's used for heavy metal testing in water, just with the difference that essentially we turn the cannabis, or the mushrooms for that matter, into a liquid by doing an acid digestion, by quite literally dissolving them in acid, because the machine that does the heavy metal testing requires that the sample is in liquid form.
Okay, cool.
And what you were saying about the minor compounds in mushrooms, that is actually really interesting. We try to test for as many as we reasonably can, and we are limited due to our regulatory status that we can only test for things where we can obtain analytical standards for, meaning something to calibrate our equipment, and it has to come from a manufacturer that meets certain ISO standards in the manufacturing processes. So we cannot just go to there's something called companies that sell experimental chemicals or research chemicals. but they cannot guarantee us the purity of the compounds, or maybe not even if it's actually the right compound at all. So we're somewhat limited in what we can test for in mushrooms by what's available from our standard providers. However, this was very similar in the early days of cannabis. It was initially was just THC and CBD, and now the average panel is like 12 different compounds. There's 5 different manufacturers that make these standards that I couldn't name right now, and there's probably more. And we also see that with the mushrooms, it's already happening. We have at least 2, if not 3 manufacturers now who make these standards, and we're already up to a total of 6 compounds: psilocybin, psilocin, plus norpsilocin, beocystin, agrocystin, and norpsilocin, I think, are the other ones. And currently we are testing for those. We are collecting the data for them. What we don't currently have is a real feedback loop from the treatment centers. This is, I think, where this will get really interesting long term. We provide this data to the growers or the producers because they're actually closer to the treatment facilities than we are. We're kind of, we're always drawn as the people in the middle, but we actually the growers come to us, we give them the results to the growers, and then the growers go out to the facilitators and the treatment centers, and they get to interact with the people that are actually administering the mushrooms. So we're hoping that eventually stuff will filter back. If we find, if a certain facilitator says, okay, I want strain whatever, Mescanita, or there's a million strain names already for mushrooms too, for treating people because it has a more positive outcome for this or that, that information will eventually filter back to the growers and hopefully to us. And then we hopefully will be able at some point to say, okay, this has a ratio of, 10 milligrams of psilocybin to 1 milligram of beocystin, and this combination apparently makes for a better experience when dealing with PTSD or something like that. That's so far all we can do is on our end is gather those data, but like it happened in the cannabis industry, that eventually all this data was even collected on websites. There were trip experience where people gave the experience with certain strains, and then the laboratories were going back and saying, okay, we've tested this strain 20 times already. What's different about the chemical composition? And that's how we learned about, compounds like THCV or CBDVA, like the minor cannabinoids with quite interesting effects. And I think long term, hopefully this will also happen for the psilocybin mushrooms. And also I think that they will find more alkaloids or more tryptamines in there.
No, yeah, that totally makes sense. And there's, it's really interesting you brought up THCV and like CB, I think you said CBG, but also like CBN is a really big one right now too. And that, I think that's so interesting because the research on that started probably, I want to say about 5 years ago, 10 years ago at this point, of like when I personally, 5 years ago is probably when I started to see the first discussion of what is a terpene and that kind of dissemination. So it's really interesting because just now, like this year, Eureka, which is like one of the biggest manufacturers of oil and concentrates in Colorado, they did their first release with 1-to-1s of THCV and CBN, like vapes. And they're awesome. Like, I really like them personally. I think they're super useful. But that's like neither here nor there. That was kind of just my example of, I think it's really interesting that we're talking now about, well, maybe, obviously there are other tryptamines, other alkaloids, and maybe they will have XYZ effect, but this data is going to take at least 5-10 years probably till we are able to get anything that's actually solid and gives us, a real evidence of this direction or this direction.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a new industry. We're literally the first lab that on some level of legality is gathering this data, and all we can do right now is gather it, and eventually it might be make it public. Their numbers, they're something that the client potentially also would have to agree with, but the growers definitely, they are allowed to publish this stuff. Like, we don't own the numbers, they own the numbers, the people who gave us the sample. So, but we still gather it to identify trends. Stuff we're already seeing, and this is only in the last 6 months, is that but growers are getting better. Like the percentage of psilocybin in mushrooms is going up. They're finding better strains. They're finding better substrates to grow it on. I mean, the curve has already begun that there's improvement visible compared to, the first samples that we got being kind of, middle of the road stuff. And now we honestly see stuff that is about 30% more potent than the stuff that we saw early on.
Yeah, no, I actually have one of our partners for the channel we've had on before now, Kyle Obenberger over at Full Canopy Genetics. He has I've talked with him a lot about kind of the current mushroom culture in Colorado, and we've been seeing a lot of exactly that. One of the first things that he gave me to try out, Old Dirty Penis Envies, through the Prop 122 exchange of fruiting bags for research, and he was like, yeah, these are about 50 to 60% stronger than your average cubes. I've kind of engineered them in that way. So yeah, I was really glad for him to get me that bag, get me the culture to get inoculated, and to because I've never been a grower before, so to get it all from him and to grow it myself, to see the whole process, and then these are mushrooms that they're not your grandfather's mushrooms, you know what I mean? This is like the first stage of the commercialized mushroom. So that was really cool because I don't have a green thumb personally, but it was really cool to be a part of that for just a second. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I'm actually really fascinated by the system, how Colorado basically approached the whole psilocybin and psychoactive substances by essentially making it legal for everything, but actually selling the mushrooms. And of course, people found these little loopholes with the grow bags. I mean, I was recently at the PsyCon, the psychedelics conference in Denver, and it was fascinating. Oregon is a bit more restrictive on this, unfortunately. As I said, here only licensed growers are legally allowed to grow these mushrooms. However, we do actually have a type of psychoactive mushrooms that grows wild here and is actually quite potent.
Oh yeah, that's I doing a little bit of research. I saw that Oregon is one of the few places in the U.S. where psychedelic mushrooms actually grow. So that'd be
psilocybin arborescens is in the spring and fall. You can find them quite easily here. They are about a double to 3 times as strong as your average cubes. So.
Wow. Oh, okay. That's insane. Are they the same? Because they're not. Are they cubes? Are they cubensis? Or are they?
They're psilocybe. They're the same genus, but they're psilocybe arborescens versus psilocybe cubensis, which are the normal what we consider cubes.
I see. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and I agree that I think that how Prop 122 dealt with personal use was really, really, really important in personal growth, because as I'm personally seeing with Full Canopy, with how they're doing things, with how I've talked with a lot of other mushroom grow companies as well, with how everyone's being able to process large amounts of genetics right now, it's really, really, really good for figuring out, what part, which alkaloids lead to XYZ in a trip kind of thing. That is, I think, huge. So I am a big advocate for Prop 122, if only because it's giving us a lot more data. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I know there's a number of labs in Colorado that are working. Some people doing really interesting DNA stuff already. Plus, mushrooms has a nice benefit that the actual growth cycle is quite a bit shorter than cannabis. Mm-hmm. So you get to try out stuff fast. You get to cross certain strains, etc., and see results within basically a few weeks to months. Versus with cannabis, you're looking at a minimum of 4 to 6 months, and that's under excellent growing conditions.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. No, I think it's going to be really interesting how all that how we're able to move forward with that and gather the data. But anyways, speaking of gathering data, I'm really interested in, because you talked a little bit earlier about how you've developed these protocols for testing. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you put together a protocol, how you gather enough data to say, all right, I know for sure that this protocol works and this is something we can send into the regulatory commission. Because you touched on that a little bit, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about like your process with creating because as someone who, you know, I was on track for a neuroscience major for a while, ended up not completing it and doing theater instead. But I've dealt with trying to create experimental protocols and procedures, and that was one of my least favorite parts of school personally. So I wanted to get a little bit more of an insight on how you're doing that for Rose City.
Yeah, I mean, there's a combination. It depends usually like how far or how unknown is what I'm going to do. In most cases, at least for example for psilocybin, there were some methodologies already used for testing, primarily for law enforcement to prosecute people, but it was at least a starting point. It also meant that we knew somewhere out there was the ability to hopefully obtain standards. And by combining that, there was a bunch of trying out on the liquid chromatograph. Fortunately, we are able to obtain DEA exempt standards for Schedule 1s here, so it wasn't too hard to get these. And at that point, there were a few different trials until we had something that we thought was working. And then you do a bunch of repetition, honestly. It's you have to be able to run, you know, the same sample, you inject it 20 times in a row, and then you calculate your how much variance you have between those. You run these same tests a week apart, repeatedly. You later on, like once you have your methodology down, then we did a bunch of trials on the actual extraction of the mushrooms, because, you know, running a clean standard is different than running the actual like natural product after it's been extracted. We essentially set up, like testing protocols with different solvent mixtures, different times, different temperatures, different ways of agitation, and eventually it became clearly pretty quickly that alcohol, specifically methanol, seemed to have been the best solvent. And then we did a number of trials on the how we effectively extract these without actually converting any of the compounds or destroying any of the compounds, and getting basically the best possible extraction, which then comes back to the machine. And then we had to rerun the same samples multiple times. We had to run with spiked samples, where we essentially spike psilocybin and psilocin in known amounts into mushroom material, and then run those, extract those through our processes, and see if we can recover all of that. Okay. All this data, its repeatability, we have to calculate statistical data based on all the numbers that we're getting, and all of this. I mean, I can recalculate even our error percentage. I can tell how far low or what the smallest amounts that I can reasonably detect and quantify. I know how high the instrument can go. All of those things were simply determined by repetition. It is lots of repetition, and then statistical analysis of all this data, and eventually you can say with like such a level of certainty, like, this methodology works, and it has worked for the last 3 weeks, or different days, different weather, different chemists potentially, sometimes different equipment. And at the end, as I said, then we can show mathematically, statistically, that okay, this really works, and that then gets all sent to to a third party. In some cases, it's ISO that accredits labs. In our case, it's State of Oregon, the ORLAB program, which is the oversight agency for all laboratories in the state. And then they go over it with a fine-tooth comb, also do statistical analysis, make sure the data is real. Not in some cases, they will request raw data samples from you, make sure that you didn't, make the data a little prettier than it really was, or something like that. Totally. And as I said, it goes even down to the point where they actually do inspections of the facilities. They do that annually or every 2 years, depending on which field you're working in. And they're nice people, and they're very supportive. The big rule is to never lie to them. As long as you can make mistakes, you can make terrible mistakes, not that you should, but if you do, they'll tell you, you can fix this, this is how you fix this, this is what we expect you to do, this is how you can get out of this. The one thing that they're absolutely don't like is you ever lie to them. That's the quickest way to lose your accreditation, and also a great way for chemists to end up in jail. That's a bit unique about working in this regulated space, is we are individually criminally liable for our actions. So if we push out knowingly false numbers, people can and have gone to jail over that.
Wow. Stakes are high. Jeez, man. I never would have, I would have essentially assumed, scientific method, practice makes perfect. It's a really old adage because it's true. It's one of the like universal constants that we've been working with for hundreds of years. But personal liability, that is a huge factor in, making sure all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So I never would have thought or processed in that realm. But it makes sense because we think about our liability as a channel all the time when it comes to what information we're putting out there, what people might take away from this, what actions they might do after watching a video kind of thing. So we're really careful to not condone anything criminal and to be on our toes about that as well. So I can relate. I guess I never would have thought about it from that perspective.
Yeah, it's a bit different, as I said, but we also constantly check our work, by the way. That's what people always wonder. It's like, well, what if the machine broke? What if you didn't extract it right? For each batch, which can have a maximum of 20 samples on it, we are required to essentially run 7 quality control standards with it, which is everything from checking the calibration of the instrument to checking our extraction to make sure that that the machine doesn't have any carryover, so we have blank samples. We duplicate samples to make sure we didn't make a mistake somewhere down the road. To basically, we check everything from the equipment to the calibration to even our calibration itself. We're required to buy these calibration standards from 2 different companies, so we can compare them against each other to make sure that the company who made the calibration standard didn't screw up, which fortunately happens very rarely, but has happened, not with psilocybin, but with some other areas that we're also testing.
Gotcha. No, that totally makes sense. Well, I appreciate your transparency and letting us know of kind of how that works, and I, from one person who has been involved in science, I don't know if I'd call myself a scientist quite, like you definitely are. But from one person to another who really appreciates scientific transparency, we'll just say that. I really respect and appreciate it on a personal level.
No, it's important. We sell numbers for a living here. That's essentially what we do, and we want to make sure that there's no doubt that we are certain about our results, and that's kind of the standard. As I said, our mushroom testing is held to the same standard as drinking water testing for elementary schools here in town, and I think that's a good thing because, again, people rely on these numbers, and we need to make sure that we do a proper job, and having a regulatory body that oversees us and makes us do that, I think is excellent. It is specifically Oregon was very early in this whole accreditation, and that the state oversees the laboratories, which is why we have a very robust organization there. And they also, as I said, they're great to work with. They have always been helpful if we were stuck on something. And as I said, the one thing you don't do is lie to them. Otherwise, they will be helpful, and we'll see you through whatever issues you run into.
That is awesome. That's really great to hear. I know a lot of people have been worried about how regulation's been going on in Oregon because it's going to really dictate how the rest of the country kind of moves, but I'm glad to hear that at the very least they're really nice and they want to help you. That's going to be step one.
On the laboratory side, definitely. As I said, we have actually 2 bodies that oversee us. They both fall under the Oregon Health Authority. I personally didn't have any problem with working either of them, but as a laboratory, we obviously work more with the ORLab, with the laboratory side, as we're effectively don't really handle the product very much, or only very briefly, or only in very small amounts. So the actual psilocybin services program is more focused on the producers as well as the treatment centers and the facilitators, because they're effectively who have the big bags of mushrooms available.
No, yeah, that makes sense. So thank you so much, Bjorn, first of all, for being on this show. I really appreciate your appearance here. I think we've gotten some really cool just information about how all of this testing works and kind of where the industry has been up until this point. I'd love to know your professional opinion like as both someone who is like really involved with R&D, with these, you know, the development of new protocols, and just like as a senior chemist who's really involved and actively like engaged with chemistry on a day-to-day basis, what do you see as some of the like really key next steps for the psychedelics industry from especially a chemistry R&D perspective, but even just in general, kind of what the next steps are for our side of the industry?
From the laboratory side, I think I believe that we should expand and make the testing for the minor compounds mandatory. Currently they're not. Oregon only requires the two big ones, which is psilocybin and psilocin, which is essentially the same compounds. Psilocybin is just a product to psilocin. They definitely should look at more compounds. Plus, where you are in Colorado, then you have even other drugs. Like I believe mescaline is legalized there as well. And
I don't think it's mescaline. I believe it's DMT, not mescaline.
Oh, DMT. Which, by the way, for the record, all those psilocybin is just 4-hydroxy DMT or 5-hydroxy DMT. They're all DMT derivatives anyway.
All of the classic psychedelics boil down to a slightly altered version of DMT. You are like totally 100% correct. Yeah. The only
really, because there's a couple. Then there's of course the synthetic ones, but that's a little separate. But yeah, I think expanding that, depending on how the market develops, I think there's going to be, specifically if it becomes a consumer product, which I honestly think it will eventually, I feel that the risk potential of psilocybin at least and magic mushrooms is lower than cannabis. Mm-hmm. And we're essentially legalizing cannabis all over the place. It's self-regulating. And I think if people... I think that people are mostly scared about it because it's the unknown aspect. It's a thing, it alters my mind and I will not know. But this is not even true. You're generally fully aware that your mind has been altered because you remember taking the mushrooms an hour ago. I mean, it's not like somebody spiked your drink or something. So I think long term, we're going to see legalization there. And at that point, if it becomes a consumer product, it should be tested as such. It should be safe. As I said, pesticides, heavy metals, solvent testing, things like that is probably going to be on the horizon. What I also wonder about is semi-synthetic versions of psilocybin. There is a couple that are popular, like 4-aceto-DMT. They have the benefit that they're easier to synthesize than the real psilocybin, have the same effects or very similar effects, and due to the fact that they can be synthetically be produced, are way easier to dose in a way. Of course, that then also carries the risk of bringing big pharma back onto the table. But as I said, if it's a consumer product, if it's a recreational product potentially, I think at that point it would be more a matter of Anheuser-Busch coming on the table than the pharmaceutical companies. But generally speaking, I think the Oregon program right now is quite restrictive, but it, in ways, really mirrors the early days of medical marijuana in this state, which was initially also quite restrictive. I think they're going to loosen up over time. I don't think we're ever going to see the boom that happened with cannabis, where dispensaries are like on every other corner now, and we have more dispensaries than coffee shops in town. But I think it will require a valid product and will be available either to some kind of, I don't know, head shop, spiritual shop, something to that effect. I think that's really where the quote-unquote consumer application lies. It will also have the medical path, or hallucinogens in general will be used in some kind of psychotherapy sessions or medical use or something, although currently in Oregon it's important to say that our program is not a medical program, it's a therapeutic program. They specifically separated that for a number of reasons. I think one of the big one was that the medical marijuana program here was in the beginning quite restricted because it was very difficult for valid patients to get the medical marijuana cards because you needed a doctor's prescription, which in turn means you needed to find a doctor that was willing to risk their medical license to prescribe a Schedule 1, which effectively is what a doctor does when they do that. So they kind of separated that out currently in Oregon. But I do think that it's effectively going to be going onto an actual medical path with proper, clinical psychologists, etc. But I think there's also going to be the the spiritual, the self-improvement, the more spiritual use, the more well-being use, and to a certain extent recreational, because in the right setting there can be a lot of fun, of course. So I think that's effectively, I think that split's going to happen. I just hope that the recreational side or the recreational side doesn't quite overtake as hard as it has happened on the cannabis side. We used to kind of run them side by side. At this point, nobody here, I mean, I would say 95% of the cannabis here is handled as recreational products, even by people who use it medically, because the availability is simply easier. Why go through the trouble of obtaining a medical card so you can get a discount at the few medical dispensaries when literally on every corner the prices here have dropped like everywhere quite dramatically? So availability is here. I just hope that that doesn't run over the medical field when something similar will happen to mushrooms, and also not necessarily the spiritual field, because there is a whole like spiritual religious aspect of it, specifically with some native cultures, which is something we try to tread very lightly, because I don't fully understand it and it's not my background, but it's definitely something I think that we need to respect.
No, I completely agree. I mean, yeah, man, that was the future of psychedelics in a lot of ways, in my opinion. I agree about your point on the commercial side of things, especially like I was saying earlier, a lot of people moved from cannabis to psychedelics specifically because of commercial bloat. So avoiding that in this industry is going to be really, 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 really key in avoiding the fallout that is currently it's ravaging the cannabis industry across the nation. Like, I know it's really, numbers are down in Colorado. I have to assume they're down in Oregon too.
Oh, yeah.
And that could have been easily avoided if more lessons were taken from alcohol and tobacco. So that we need to be more keen on what we're doing when it comes to psychedelics, in my opinion.
Yeah, Oregon tried this a little bit here by limiting the market. They did pause issuing licenses for cannabis businesses for a while, but there was already so much issued, and right now the market is oversaturated, the prices are down, the testing requirements are going up, and it's a bit of a shock for the market. And of course, the wonderful investor money is no longer flowing in from every direction like it was in the early years. I think some of that is a little bit, I see it almost a little bit like the dot-com crash almost. Like it is initially, everybody was pumping money into it, and everybody thought they could get rich off of it. This is honestly the reason why we here at Rose City Labs are a full environmental lab. We're diversified because cannabis is, even from a testing side, which is legally required by law here, it's a very seasonal thing. And we have costs that are running all the time, so that's why we're offering all our other testing services. Partially also, as I said, that's why we offer specialty things like the Amanita mushroom testing. Generally, we do almost anything if somebody's willing to pay for it, with the limitation of we don't touch Schedule 1s other than cannabis or psilocybin. But we have, as I said, we test the consumer products, we test the vitamins, we test pretty much. Somebody comes to us and has an idea for a test, we'll most likely be able to make it happen. And that's, by the way, again, why I like my job here so much.
Hey, dude, that's awesome. Well, to our viewers at home, if you ever need any testing done, go to Rose City Labs, especially if you're in the Portland area. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much, Bjorn. You've definitely taught me, and I'm sure everyone else, you've taught us a lot just about what it means to have our drugs tested and kind of what the industry is looking like right now. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for everyone at home, if you also enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It is super, super, super helpful to the channel. And as always, don't get psyched out. Cool. Awesome. Thank you
did
so
much. You did the subscribe thing. I was waiting for that the entire time.